Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this third online talk in partnership with the Parks Trust of Milton Keynes for the Butterfly Conservation Upper Thames branch. This evening, we will be looking at recording and surveying techniques, and I will hand you over to the chair, Nick Bowles, who is the chair for the Upper Thames Region branch. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Carla. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I was saying in the little chat we had before we started that one of the things that I think my branch does fairly badly is get back to recorders to thank them for the records they send in. And I'm very conscious of that. So I wanted this meeting, this event today, to be a chance to say thank you to all the people that do send in records and to encourage you to send even more if that's possible. We're going to go through, first of all, ways that you can record your sightings, that is the different ways of storing them so that they get used. I'm also going to tell you about the different types of surveys that we run. So the actual technique of surveying is in the next meeting, Thursday next week, where I'll talk in detail about how to run a transect or a wider countryside butterfly survey and so on. So that particular detail, which is a bit technical, will be in next week's meeting. Tonight it's a bit more general, but we welcome all your questions, please, which if you could stick them into the chat, then Ellen will look after that. I'm going to share my screen now and we'll get started. So I'll just ask Carla, can you see that, please?
I can, yes.
Thank you. Now I've got this annoying bar across the top, which always appears. Is it visible to everybody? It's gone away again now. Anyway, I'll start. If it's there, I can't do much about it. I discovered yesterday when I was doing one of these. So
I can't see anything.
Okay, that's great. I thought it might just be me that can see it, but it keeps popping back up to tell me that I'm talking. One of the reasons that we do the surveying in the first place and then recording detail of what we've seen is that we'd have no idea what was around. We wouldn't know which butterflies were about, and we wouldn't know which of them were rare if no one was recording them. So it's really important that people do make sightings and try to identify things down to species, but then that they also record their sightings, because we just cannot, I'm afraid, conserve everything. There are 2,600 species of moth in this country, huge number, most people are surprised. There's about 56 species of butterfly, and with the best will in the world, we just can't do everything. So it makes some sense to start with the things which are either very rare already or those which are reducing in numbers very quickly. And one of those, which is very rare already, is the marsh fritillary. And that's why across the country, the Butterfly Conservation Organization, in conjunction with several others, is doing a lot to try and help the marsh fritillary. Now, this little clipping I've got here is the only one I could find easily to pop up to say about work being done for the for the RSPB and the marsh fritillary up in Cumbria. But some of you might have been part of a Zoom call this week with Sanctuary, which is the MOD arm of nature conservation, and they were talking about a new colony in Hampshire. I couldn't find anything online to put up on the screen, but Upper Thames branch members were involved in that, and we are involved in the attempt to bring back the marsh fritillary just north of Oxford at a site called Otmore. So it's going on all over, and the reason is that we know the marsh fritillary is not just very rare in England. It's slightly commoner actually in West Scotland than it is in England, but it's very rare across Europe. So we're doing our best to help it. And it isn't only the very rare and quite colourful species. This is actually something about dingy skippers. You can probably see my mouse moving. And dingy skippers are not the prettiest butterfly, but they are rare. And there's, as you see in the title, the idea that homes and roads, new offices, and so on can be either completely prevented from being built on top of the homes of these things, or at least the way that the building is done can be done in a way which is more sensitive. When you send in all your records, they help to produce these local maps. Now, you might have seen maps like this in our books. I'll put a cover picture in a book of a book up in a moment. But here you can see all the records for the brimstone between 2015 and 2019. And we produce a map like this for every species, and we use them to compare to see whether things are doing better or worse within our 3 counties. And for those who are a bit confused by the map, because I agree it's just a big blob to most people, so moving the mouse around, this is Buckinghamshire here on the east. Berkshire is a relatively narrow section down here at the bottom in the south, and Oxfordshire is this bigger area over here in the west. And as you can see, it would appear that no brimstones live in this area, northwest Oxfordshire, at all. But we know that isn't true. Well, actually, I can't say we know it isn't true. We suspect it isn't true because we know that when we do send people to look for it, they find it. And we think it's just that there are few recorders in this area, and that's why we haven't got so many records. And if you were to look to see where the larger towns are, you'd find that's where the darker colours are, apart from some very, very good sites along the Chilterns here and into the West Berkshire Downs. Because where there are larger conurbations of people, we get more recorders and people see the brimstone in their gardens. So we get these hot spots which just sort of pop up. That's probably Milton Keynes there, I would think. And Oxford will be here somewhere, and so on. Reading down here could be, or maybe it's a bit lower. Anyway, the point is that where there are people, we get records. Where there are fewer people, we get fewer records. But this gives a good idea of where the butterflies are found. And those records all go together to help us create books like this one, which was one of the first books produced about the butterflies of this area of Britain. This is the most recent iteration of that particular type of book. And this, same thing, but for moths. Now, we don't have a local moth atlas. There is a book of the micro moths of Berkshire, but there is no book of the macro moths, that's the larger moths of this region. This one, the atlas, as you can see, of Britain and Ireland's larger moths is a relatively new publication, but it takes data from all the regions, obviously, to produce that. So when you send your records in, even though sometimes you might send records off and get very little in way of acknowledgement, it is all used. None of it goes to waste. So how do we go about surveying? I thought we'd start here. If I was about to go for a survey, what would I take with me? Let's start up at the top and go round in a sort of clockwise direction. Well, for some people, it's really important that they take a notepad and pen or a pencil because that's the way they like to record. And if you are taking a notebook and a pencil, you'll probably need a map because you will need to be absolutely sure where you are when you see things. If you just vaguely say, I was somewhere near Oxford, or it was sort of west of west of Bracknell, that's not really very helpful. We need to know precisely where you were when you see things. And that's why I personally prefer to use a phone. Because when you make records in your phone, the phone has a GPS unit built in. And as long as you've activated the GPS and allowed it to talk to the apps that you're using to collect the data, it will record exactly where you are for you at the time. So you don't have to look it up later. You don't have to worry about working out on a map exactly what the grid reference was, which can be a tricky thing. I would suggest that every time you go out looking for butterflies, you want a pair of binoculars, because butterflies are not necessarily obliging. They won't always sit so close that you can see them. They're very often the other side of a ditch or the other side of a bramble patch, and it's far easier with binoculars to be certain about the species that you're looking at than it is without. And of course, some species live right at the top of trees almost all their life, things like purple hairstreak, and without binoculars, it really would be near impossible. Next to the binoculars, I've put a net. Now, this is a bit controversial. You'd need permission to use a net in some places, like Beebout reserves, for instance. You'd need to get permission first. But for some species, I think a net is invaluable. And the species where I use it most are the white butterflies, which tend otherwise just to fly straight past me, and the two golden skippers, the small and the Essex. It is perfectly possible to collect a butterfly into a net, to look at it in the net, decide what it is, and release it without doing any damage. I appreciate there are people who don't like the idea of nets, and there's certainly an argument that if you walk about using a net and other people see you, they might copy you because they might think it's cool to go around chasing things and catching them. So it does need a certain amount of care, but for some species, it is very helpful. Below these, I've got three things here which are helpful but not essential. So I've got a pair of glasses because it might be that you really do need your glasses on to look at some butterflies and get the right species ID, because the difference between them is a very small difference that needs good eyesight to spot it. If your eyesight's good, you don't need the glasses, but if you know you need glasses to read, you really probably will need them to sort out, for instance, those skippers. You might want a camera, because a camera is always useful. If you see something you're not quite sure whether it's one species or another, you can get a picture. You can add the picture to your record when you send it in, and then somebody else can help you identify it. And I've put a thermometer there because quite a few of the different recording schemes want to know what the temperature was when you were out recording, because certain species are more likely to fly in cool weather and others only in hot weather. So that helps us decide if the reason you didn't see something was because it was a bit too chilly that day. And then moving to the left, things which are more for your use than for recording the butterflies. You might want to take a drink and a snack, and I would suggest that's a very good idea if you think you're going to be out for more than 2 hours. And you might want to take some sort of identification guide. Now, obviously, if it's something like the sheet I've drawn there, which was just for aid memoir, then it's going to be a bit bulky and difficult to use in the field if the wind's blowing. But some sort of identification guide might be useful. My opinion actually is that it's probably better to get a photo and look at the identification guide later, because by the time you get a book out and page through it to the right page, the butterfly's gone, and that isn't awfully helpful. So when would we survey and where would we survey? Well, actually, you can do a survey every day of the year if you want, but you'll be looking for different things. Most butterflies and most moths fly in the summer when it's warmer, because being creatures that cannot control their body temperature, they have to live at the temperature of the surroundings. They're much more active when the weather's warm. But there are moths flying all year, and the butterflies and the moths that fly in the summer have a different life stage that's around somewhere in the winter. So you can go looking for the eggs, the caterpillars, and the chrysalis of butterflies and moths at any time. It doesn't necessarily mean that you only have to survey the adults. It's entirely possible to survey for the younger life stages as well. And those records are equally valid. It's actually easier to find some species in their younger life stages, partly because they are more numerous. I mean, I think you probably know this already, but I'll just repeat it, that there are more eggs laid which hatch into more caterpillars than ever get to turn into butterflies or moths, because they get eaten. Things eat them, or they get diseased and die. So there are always more of the younger stages than there are of the adult stages, which makes them slightly easier to find just because they're more numerous, but sometimes they're awfully good at hiding away. So it does depend a little bit on the species, but it can be easier to find the young stages. So don't think you can only go looking for things when they're flying about as adults. And where to survey? Well, I would argue that going to better known places is probably a mistake. I bet somebody else is already going there, and with any luck, they are sending their sightings in. So although going to some of these better known places is a good idea to get your eye in, to get a look at a species that's hard to find in other places, I would ask, if you can, please try and survey some places where there is less, where it's less well known, and there's probably fewer species, but we don't get records from those places so often, and we do need them. We need a balance of records from places which are visited by 5 or 6 butterfly recorders or 5 or 6 moth recorders every week. And we also need records from places where perhaps only one person goes all year. And some of those places, like I just showed you in northwest Oxfordshire, where almost no one has gone in that 5-year period, 15 to 19. This one's trickier, what to count when you're surveying. The first thing, I've made the point here that if something is quite easy to see and you can tell what it is, for instance, brimstone butterfly, you can see that easily 20 meters away, and you know what it is because there's nothing else that color yellow that flies about at this time of year. That's, pretty simple. It has to be a brimstone. There isn't really anything else you can confuse it with. But remember, lots of other butterflies and moths are so small and relatively inconspicuous that you're not going to be able to see them at that distance and identify them. So if you write down all the big, easy to identify things that you see at their greatest distance from you where you can identify them, you will tend to get more of them proportionally as the total of things you identify, because the smaller ones you have to be a lot closer. So inevitably you're going to see fewer that you can identify. It doesn't mean you shouldn't record all these big things, which are easy, but it does mean give some thought to whether you might be, as it were, overestimating how many of them there are compared with the slightly smaller and more difficult species, just because they're so much easier to identify. So do record them, but concentrate on things a bit closer to you rather than looking way into the distance all the time. And then this is far more important, try to avoid double counting. So for instance, you might be recording in your garden, most of us do, and as you are out there in your garden, let's say you're out there for 45 minutes, something like a holly blue comes into the garden, flies around briefly, and off it goes again. One holly blue. 10 minutes later, a holly blue is back in the garden briefly and then gone again. And then 15 minutes later, a holly blue is back in the garden. I would argue that that is one holly blue because you've only seen one holly blue at a time. Now, with holly blues, you might be able to tell the males from the females, in which case you could say, well, I know the first one that came in was a male and the second one was a female. So there were at least two. That's absolutely fine. But try not to count every single butterfly that you see, because quite often butterflies will fly past you in one direction and then turn around and come back the other way, which could give the impression that there are twice as many as there actually are. A good tip for counting butterflies, moths, a bit like birds, is to aim to record the most which are visible at any one time. Okay, so how are we going to record all these sightings? We've been out there, we've been to places, hopefully, where not everybody else has been. We've seen things, we're fairly sure of what we've seen. How are we going to record the sightings? There's always the good old pen and paper. Many people like using pen and paper. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It's a good way to do things, but in a modern age, it might be a little bit slower than some others. A few people, and indeed this includes an organization called the UK BMS, you can see their logo here, they believe that when we go out recording butterflies, we ought to take a proper sheet with us to make sure everything is recorded in a systematic way. I'm not personally convinced that that is entirely necessary, and I think if you're fairly well organized, you can do it on a piece of paper perfectly adequately. But they say if you're going to use paper, get it all set out on a proper form first. Okay. But I like to use this app on my phone. It's completely free. You can put it onto Apple phones and you can put it onto the Google-based phones. So they both provide a free app, both those platforms. It's called I Record Butterflies. It was developed by the CEH, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology down here, look, and Butterfly Conservation jointly, using funding from these other people. And the University of Bristol did a lot of trial work on it. I Record Butterflies is not just good because it helps you record what you've seen, but it also includes a guide to tell you if you're not entirely sure what you've seen. But let's come to that in a minute. What will happen is you will go into iRecord. It says here loading on the left, doesn't it? And it will open up on a page similar to the one you see on the right now. You'll see that it says you're doing a survey, and it will fill in the date for you. Now, if you're thinking it 19th of March, it's only the 18th. Yes, but look, it's 2014. So it fills in the date automatically as the day that you are actually switching the app on. But if you want, you can go back to dates previously if you're filling it in to record something you saw yesterday or last week. But it assumes you're going to start with today. And then it says edit required location details. When you click here, after you've selected a date, you'll find that it gets you to write in the name of a place, but it does the GPS for you if you've allowed it to. And this is really helpful because when we come to look at these records later, we check to see whether what you've written down as the place where you are matches what your phone's GPS said. And you'd be surprised how often people somehow manage to get two completely different places. And it highlights to us that when they say they're in one position and the phone says they're somewhere else, that it's worth asking them. And they quite often say, oh, I don't know why I put that. I know I wasn't there. I was at so-and-so. And we say, oh, yes, that's what your phone told us, but you've written something else. So that's a good way of checking. And it's so simple. The phone does it for you. You'll notice here it says 3 species. Well, you can't see them because it wouldn't all fit. But what you get here in this section where it says add species are pictures. Down the page as you scroll, you bring up all these little pictures, and it shows you a picture beginning with the species which is most likely on this particular date in the location that you've told it you're recording. So using years of previously collected data, it predicts what you're going to see. And probably 90% of the time, what it says as the first, second, or third butterfly are the ones that you are looking at. It's very rare that it's wrong. So it will predict, for instance, in March, you're most likely to see a peacock. And you simply press plus for the number that you've seen. So on this particular day, it would appear that someone, possibly me, saw 6. And then they've gone down, they've added, having put the peacock data in, they've clicked add species, and then they've selected another butterfly down here. And this time I can just see that they saw 4 of them, whatever that was. So it's really simple. You simply click on the picture of the butterfly you've seen, click the number up or down to get the right number there, and then add species to survey to add another one. And then you send. So you've done the whole thing on your phone while you're out in the field. You don't get home and think to yourself, oh, did I see 3 of those, or was one of them in a different field? So it's all sorted out for you as you go along. One word of warning about this: if you're already using the iRecord Butterflies app and you've got any data in it at the moment, so if you've been recording in your garden perhaps, or when you've been out driving around, you've spotted a brimstone and you've stuck that into your phone, but you haven't yet sent it off to the big database that holds all this information, could you send it as soon as possible, please? You'll notice that it says in the coming weeks. Well, this was about a fortnight back. So very soon, sometime in April, there's going to be an update, and anything in your phone that you haven't sent in will get lost. Everything that you've already sent in will remain saved. Nothing will be lost that is sent in, but anything which is only in your phone will disappear when they overwrite the software with the update. Okay, so having put all your data into iRecord through the iRecord Butterflies app, you can go home, log into iRecord on a PC, and bring up something like this. And this shows records that I've made, whenever it was. Can't see the date, doesn't matter. Oh, there we are, 170920. So on that day, here's a list of the things that I saw, and it very handily put spots on the map to show me where I was. If I was to click, if I was in iRecord, I'm not obviously, but if I was to click on any of these, it would come up red to show me which little dot it represents. And all these colored circles are the ones which represent the data that I recorded in 2020. So everything is there on a map. It's really easy to see. and it makes it a lot easier to know what you've been doing if you can see it pictorially like this. Now, we've got loads of information for you on our website that tells you about these different things. So for instance, the iRecord Butterflies app I just talked about is mentioned here. And the way that you would find it would be by going either to conservation, and I'll show you in a moment, you could come in that way, or butterflies or moths. So any of those three drop-down menus will take you through to the recording pages. You'll notice that here we've got a little bit of first sightings, and just to say that any record that you ever send in to the Upper Thames branch to put onto the website in the sightings section here is stored. We keep that and we make sure it goes into the database. And don't worry if you send it in here and you put it on iRecord, because we can automatically weed out all the duplicates. So better to record it twice than not to record it once. So having clicked on the drop down for conservation, you'll see that it says first hit, conservation and recording. If you were to click on butterflies, the butterfly recording you can see is at the bottom there, and the same with moths. If we clicked on moths, it would be moth recording at the bottom of that list. And then if we went through, if we followed the links, we'd come to this part of our Upper Thames branch website, which would show you that at the top here, look, we've got stuff about the BNM, Butterflies for New Butterflies for the New Millennium recording. And that's a system here, which actually is based on iRecord, but is a separate standalone portal, which has got special ways of recording butterflies, their eggs, their larvae, their pupa, the whole lot, in a way which is slightly easier to use than the main iRecord system if you know it. There's mention of the iRecord Butterflies app, and here we are, links to go in and get it for free. Also the iRecord main program itself, and there are also butterfly record spreadsheets. Now, I think we've got some examples of those in a minute, so we'll ignore that for now. And you could, if you want, just email things or even send an old-fashioned letter to the Butterfly Records officer. And you can get special forms for gardens and churchyards by clicking in the link here. So we think we've covered everything. This is a link for people who want to record things on their PC, laptop. These iRecord Butterfly apps are really for smartphones. iRecord can be used on a PC, laptop, smartphone, everything really that's electronic. Spreadsheets for those who prefer to work perhaps in Excel on a computer in front of them. And you've got the address of the Butterfly Records officer, so you can just post things in or email to him. And for those who want them, garden and churchyard forms, you can download them in an Excel form, and then you can fill them in and send them back either electronically, or you could fill them in on paper if you printed them out and post them back. And if you really don't like computers and you're not quite sure how to go about downloading forms, simply ask and we will send you those. We'll post them out to you, and then you can post them back when you filled them in. So that's butterfly recording. Moth recording is a bit more difficult in that the very first thing you need to do, I think, is get in touch with the appropriate county moth recorder for the area where you intend to record and ask them how they would like the records, because unfortunately it isn't quite so simple that they can all accept every single different way that you might like to send your records in. But we'll stick with butterflies for a minute. So this is a look at the computerized form, the sort of PC and laptop form of the recording. This is the Butterflies for the New Millennium. And you can see that what you do is you go in, you click on it, create a new account, register yourself. Once you've logged in, you can then go through and you can start filling in, a bit like that app, Butterfly app, but it's now asking you to do things like find where you were on a map here, which is slightly more difficult, I think, than just letting your phone sort it out for you. But this does have the advantage that when you get through this stage, it allows you to record detail about eggs, larvae, pupa, and various other things about the butterfly, like the habitats they were in and so on. So there's a bit more detail here. As I said, you could do your records on paper if you want, and this is just showing you that there is a space where you can go in our website, you can get all these different forms and you can download them. You could have a sheet for use in the general countryside, an Excel spreadsheet you can download, print out and take with you, the way that the UK BMS say that we really ought to do it, by taking a sheet with us rather than just a sheet of paper. And I put this up because this is important, especially at the moment. Really, you shouldn't go out doing any surveying if you think it's going to be hazardous. So that would include COVID. And if you know that you would have to walk along a footpath where you're hemmed in by hedges on both sides, and there is no way to avoid people coming towards you and you don't want to do it, then please don't. We're not asking anyone to go out surveying if they think it's risky. If you know that the route takes you over a rickety bridge that you might fall off, if you know that you've got to climb over a barbed wire fence and you don't fancy it, please don't do it. Never feel that you should put your safety at risk to help us. Now, it does say here about insurance, and this has changed slightly since I wrote this. If you are collecting data for us, and you ever have done in the past, then you will be covered. But if you're going out for your very first time to do some species recording for butterfly conservation and nobody knows that you're going, then insurance companies being what they are, they might say, well, how do we know you were going out to do it? You'd never done it before. You just fell over and now you're pretending. So it's worth telling us, if you've never been out recording before, it's worth telling us before you go that you intend to do it, just in case you should have an accident. But I can tell you that nobody from the Upper Thames branch has ever claimed that they had an accident when they were out surveying. Of course, that's because they were all dead. No, I shouldn't say that, should I? Right, so as it says here, you can walk around in the countryside without insurance, and most of us do. You don't need to worry about this insurance, but if you would like the insurance, then it is a good idea, if you've never collected any records for us before, just to mention it before you go, that that's your plan for this year. And then once again, repeating all the bits here, let's go on. This just shows what it looks like if you do download one of those Excel spreadsheets. I should think most people are familiar with Excel spreadsheets, but it does have headings so that we make sure that we capture all the information that we want, so that we don't get it from you and then have to email you and say, what did you mean when you said you went to, let's say, Marcham? Whereabouts in Marcham were you? So just to go back through that, because there was quite a lot of stuff there, wasn't there? You can do it most easily, I think, with the free iRecord Butterfly app. Your smartphone will help you to a great extent. You can record moths this way as well, but I'll come to that. If you prefer, you can write it all down on paper when you're out in the field. And in the height of summer, that is actually easier because there are so many butterflies about, it's hard to work the phone quickly enough. Well, perhaps it is for an old codger like me, and you young folks will do it easily, but I find it hard. I literally go for walks where I see over 1,000 butterflies on that one walk. And it's much easier to write them down in groups of 5 on a piece of paper. Anyway, when you get home, if you wish, you can transfer it from a PC into the new Millennium thingy that we mentioned, or onto an iRecord program, which you can register for. If you like using PCs, but don't want to get into all these apps and things and registering for stuff, you can just put it onto an Excel sheet. And if you want, you can print the sheet and just write it out. Or you could send us in the post the notes that you made in the field. We'd rather, to be honest, that people don't do that, because we get, and I'm not joking, we get hundreds of thousands of records. And if we had to copy them all out from somebody's handwritten sheet into a computer, it would take weeks. And we don't have enough volunteers to do it. So thankfully, almost everybody these days is using the smartphone apps and the PC recording forms, which means it's so much simpler to merge all the data together into one collated database. Now, moth recording. As I said, it's slightly more difficult because there are 3 different county moth recorders. So one for Berkshire, and that's the vice county of Berkshire, which includes quite a bit of Oxfordshire.
I know, can I just interrupt because you've got a
sure.
question going
Yeah,
back.
sorry, I should have waited.
So yeah, so you've got questions like, does this cover does the insurance cover third-party liability?
Yes. Well, it depends what you mean. It covers any liability that might arise from you when you're out on your walk injuring someone else, but it wouldn't cover a landowner. So if a landowner invited you in to do some surveys, that wouldn't be covered. So as an individual, you are covered, but not as a landowner. I hope that answers the question, but they can come back through the chat if that's not what they meant, can't they?
Yep, okay, great, thank you.
Nothing else at the minute, Ellen?
No, nothing else yet, thank you.
Right, I'm probably going so fast that no one's got time to type. Anyway, let's crack on. So there are 3 moth recorders, the Berkshire County, the Oxfordshire County, and the Bucks County. And very helpfully, they're all called Martin, which actually isn't awfully helpful, is it? But anyway, they are all called Martin. And these 3 men like their records in slightly different ways because the underlying software to their own databases find it easier to accept the data in slightly different ways. So in Berkshire, Martin Harvey is quite happy with information coming in through iRecord, whereas Martin Albertini in Bucks prefers it coming in through MapMate and Excel, and Martin Townsend in Oxfordshire prefers it sort of any way it can come in at all, really, but Excel is probably easiest. So it's worth asking them before you collect a lot of data how they'd like it, because obviously they'd prefer it in a way that makes it easier to meld it in with the database that they're using. And as you'll see at the bottom of this little bit, you've probably read it while I've been rabbiting on. If you're worried about identifying something and think you might have got it wrong, before you send it in, you can ask the Bucks Moth Conservation Officer, which is actually Dave Wilton, not Martin Albertini. You can ask him if he'll help you identify it before you send the record in. So basically the same information is required by these moth recorders, but perhaps through different systems of recording it. They're going to need the species name, and it wouldn't hurt to give both the common English name, so to speak, and the scientific name. They would like a location with an OS grid reference as well as the name of the place, the nearest village or the nearest farm or something like that, or a postcode. If you can't do the OS grid references, they can work from postcodes. I haven't heard that any of them use the what 3 words, but that would be another way of recording where you were, but I don't think they do that. They're going to want the date of the sighting and the name of the person who recorded what they saw, and although it doesn't say it here, they would like to know how many of the species you saw. So not only its name, but how many, whether you only saw 1 or whether you saw 20. So a lot of moth recorders used in the old days, before some of the more modern software got started, to use a program called MapMate, which is very good. And if you want to, you can get MapMate, but as you'll spot in this little flyer that they send out, MapMate 2, it's been updated, it's been made better and better, but it costs £36. Now you might say, well, that's not much, is it? £36, I'm going to use it for the rest of my life. And I agree, £36 isn't much for something you're going to use for the rest of your life, but you could just use an Excel spreadsheet, and you've probably got Excel spreadsheets in your computer already, and you wouldn't have to buy them. It's worth downloading a pre-made. Now I've just happened to download the Scottish one because that's the one that popped up first. I don't think it'd be very different to the ones for each of the different counties. They're going to ask you for the same things that we just mentioned: the dates, the place where you were, the grid reference for it, VC. Well, if you're only sending to one county moth recorder, that's not so important. And then species shortcut is the name, basically, quantity, common name, taxon, blah, blah, blah. So they all ask for similar things so that they can help to ease that data from the Excel spreadsheet into their database. iRecord. Now, iRecord has a special section for moth records. You can, if you want, as some of you will probably already know, download iRecord, which is free, into your computer once you've registered for it. And you can click record here, and you can record in terms of just general records, a list from a site maybe, or a single sighting. You can record moths in that way, but there is actually an area set up specially just for people who are recording moths. And this is specially made so that it's slightly easier for you to use. For instance, it asks you about your sampling method. Were you using wine ropes? Were you just walking around shining a torch on things? Was it a daytime survey where you were walking and recording day flying moths? Had you got a light trap? If so, which type was it? And so on. And then down here in the yellow, if you're recording larva, cases, leaf mines, blah, blah, add the food plant. But there are spaces for all this information to go in, which if you had gone through the general recording here, you'd have to write it all out in comments rather than having a special cell pop up to remind you. So this is a very good way of doing it, but not all of the counter recorders are happy about that, because the way that this outputs data, it doesn't work well with the database they have as an existing database. So you need to check. Now, there is also online recording. At one time, we had something called Moths Count, where we were being subsidized, that's Butterfly Conservation, to sponsor moth recording. And there was a special website area you could go to after clicking here, as it says, and you could download a little bit of a program and you could put all your moth records into that. Well, that unfortunately seems to have come to an end because we lost the funding. That's a sad tale for most charities recently, isn't it? But Butterfly Conservation and the CEH Centre for Ecology Hydrology, they're going to launch a new app. It's mysteriously referred to as appearing this spring. I'm not quite sure when spring is. I've got a feeling that spring starts in 3 days, but I doubt whether the app will be there in 3 days. So keep an eye out for it if this is the way that you like to do things, because this is probably going to be a good way. I haven't seen it, so I can't say for certain. But the other stuff that Butterfly Conservation and CEH have done together has been extremely user-friendly. So I think this will be a very worthwhile investigation looking into that.
Hi Nick, we've got a question of how do we access the moth section of iRecord?
Well, I do it the cheaty way. I put iRecord moths into Google and it takes me straight to it. And then I have to log in as the user that I am, my registration. But that's how I find it. So there's probably a way when you get there. I bet if you look at the record, if I go back a couple of pages, if we go here to record, I would imagine it's in the drop-down menu you get when you press on record. But I confess I don't know, because I cheat and find it through Google. So
Yeah.
Hope that helps, but I'm sure it must be fairly simple. And if anyone tries while I'm talking, if anyone goes off and has a look and says I can't find it, then I will find a way to do it, and we'll put it on our website, because the recording of this will go up on the website, and I'll make sure that there is an addendum or whatever added to it so that it tells you how to find that.
Someone's added to the chat that you go record, then species, group forms, and then there's a moths option from there.
Right, thank you. I thought it would be fairly simple, but I'm even simpler, so I just use Google to find it for me.
Thank you to Kerry and Tim for those answers.
Yep, thank you very much. So, various different bits and pieces. This is a piece from Butterfly Conservation's website telling you about different ways that you might want to look at information about recording and all these different organizations here, this is all found on the Butterfly Conservation website pages. Okay, I don't want to leave iRecord without mentioning that while you're out in the field and looking at all those incredible butterflies and fantastic moths, you're going to see other stuff too. And you might, I would hope, be as interested in that as you are in the butterflies and moths. Well, perhaps not quite as interested. Let's face it, they're not quite as interesting, are they? But if you saw a bird and you wanted to record it, because some people do, or more likely, if you saw something really interesting like a fantastic hoverfly or a wonderful dragonfly, you might want to record that. And having iRecord in your phone makes it simple, because just like we were talking about with the pictures of the butterflies, here are the pictures of the dragonflies and things. I think it's slightly trickier because there are so many thousands and thousands and thousands of possibilities with all the invertebrates and all the mammals and all the amphibians, blah, 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 that iRecord holds within it. It is a bit trickier to use in the field, but it is there, and it is worth recording everything you see, not just the butterflies and moths. Okay, I'll pause for breath just a moment and see, Ellen, do you have any more questions that anyone's had time to type in?
No more questions yet.
Okay, thank you. As I say, I go at such a pace, people are probably struggling to keep up, haven't got time to type. So, types of recording schemes. So this isn't how you go about doing things, but it's how you might get involved in special sorts of recording, apart from just going for a walk in the countryside. One thing that we do is called transects. So you might become part of a transect team, which would mean that you'd be walking a fixed route at a relatively fixed speed, certain weeks of the year, and recording what you see. You wouldn't have to take this particular sheet with you, but this sheet is designed for transect walkers. The really good thing about this is that if you were part of a survey team doing a transect, you would know that your data can be compared with the data that comes from anyone else's transect anywhere in the country in any year, because every single person doing a transect records their data in exactly the same way. So if we were to hear that although you thought you'd done very well because you'd seen 15 green hair streaks, other people in other sites had seen twice that number, then you might think, oh, my site isn't as good as I thought. I thought it was really good with 15 green hair streaks, but if other people are seeing 30, then it's just a good year for green hair streaks, and actually my site isn't all that good. I hope you can see how this is really helpful, because some years, last year for instance, people were complaining that common blue seemed to be doing quite badly, and transect results showed that that was actually true, because right across the UK, everybody recording in this standardized way with transects was saying the same thing. There were a few sites where the trend was bucked, some sort of blip, but that was also very helpful, because by looking in detail at what was different about those sites, we could work out why the common blue was doing slightly better there than it was in other places. And just to finish that off, it was usually because those sites were quite wet sites. And the trouble that the common blue had last year was that the food plant that the butterfly lays its eggs on was drying out. The ground was so dry in late April and early May that the caterpillars weren't able to get enough nutrient from the food they were eating. But one or two damper sites where perhaps normally the common blue wouldn't do too well, because being a bit wetter, they were also a bit colder, the common blue got through quite well, about the same as usual. But everywhere else where it was much drier, the common blue caterpillars really struggled. So we can learn a lot from transects. They tell us a great deal about how butterfly populations are changing across the country and across the years. They also, for instance, tell us about something called phenology. So because everybody across the country is recording what they see each week from the 1st of April right through till the end of September, we can see that over the years, things have got earlier. And one species which has definitely got a lot earlier is orange tip. The first orange tip has already been seen in the UK this year, but that one's a bit of an outlier, almost certainly one that pupated in an artificially warm site. But orange tips have got about 2 weeks earlier in the last 30 years than they used to be, just because of global warming, we assume. And it's not just one site in the UK, it's right across the UK. So in Scotland, they still fly later than they do in England, but they fly earlier there, just as they fly earlier in England, earlier than they used to 30 years ago. There is something very similar, but a much simpler system called the Wider Countryside Butterfly Scheme or Butterfly Survey. And this, just like the BTO's Breeding Bird Survey, is intended to collect data in a way which can be standardized. So people set off and walk a 1 kilometer long transect, which is, as you can see, broken into sections. But the beauty of this, the reason that makes it so much easier than doing the transects, is that instead of going out for week after week through the summer, you might only go twice. But again, because the data is collected in a standardized way, it's possible to compare it. And the places where people do this are all selected at random. So instead of, rather like the transects, choosing for yourself to go somewhere where you're going to see lots of exciting and rare butterflies, this system or this scheme sends you off to places which have been chosen at random. So you tend to see more ordinary butterflies and get a much better feel for what's actually going on in the wider countryside, rather than the honeypot sites of nature reserves. It says butterflies are counted using the Pollard walk method, which isn't much help to those who don't know what it is. I'll be going into that next week, but it means a method in which you're recording in a standardized way. As I said, you're walking a fixed route and you're walking at a standard pace, and you're only counting butterflies at a certain distance from you. And as I said, it's much simpler, a minimum of 2 visits. But if you wish, you can go more often, but you don't need to. So there's not the same responsibility on a person undertaking this as there would be if they were part of a transect team, where they really have got to go within a particular week. And if they don't go, that week gets missed and it messes up the data. Here you can choose to go any time in the year. Usually people will try and go in July and again in August at some point, doesn't matter what, but they might go a bit more often as well. Now, all these little dots on this map of our region, so you can see Milton Keynes up here, look, Reading down here, across here towards Lechlade. This area, these dots are the ones which were thrown up as the random sites for wider countryside butterfly surveys in our area. There are 28 altogether. Those of you who are really quick might have counted up to 28 already.
And we've got some questions come in. Shall I ask them now?
Yeah, go on then. Let's have a go.
Okay, so firstly, does the WCBS only work on the squares that the BTO BBS applies to?
No, it's done in conjunction with the BTO BBS, but they're not all the same squares. So some of them are separate from the BTO BBS, and in the area of the Upper Thames branch, we've actually got extra squares. I wasn't going to mention them today, but as the question has come up, in the Chilterns, there are 50 extra squares. So there's only 28 in the whole 3 counties, but because the Chilterns is such a hot spot, and because there is an organization trying to get a feel for what's going on in the Chilterns called the Chalk Cherries Chair Project, they've set up 50 extra wider countryside butterfly survey squares in the Chilterns. So they're not quite the same as the BTO BBS. A lot of them are, but they're not all. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. And we got a second question is, if 2 people go together, do they make separate records?
Okay, that one's tricky. If 2 people go together, it can lead to what I would call false recording, because either, depends on the people. If they're a little bit like me and they talk too much, they might actually miss things because they get involved in a conversation and they record less than they should. Or, as you've just alluded to with the question, it could be that you've got 2 pairs of eyes and they're both recording things, and you end up with more being recorded than a single observer on their own would have seen. So my suggestion is, if you go out with 2 people, you can do it in 3 ways. One person is completely mute the entire time. They just walk around to be companionable. Another way is that one person does all the observing and the other person does the scribing. So one person is looking around while the other person writes down what they're told has been seen, and they're not allowed to chip in. Well, you just missed that purple emperor that was sat on that log. You walked straight past it. So they just write down. And then a third way is that before you start, you agree. I'm going to do the skippers, the whites and the blues. You're going to do all the things like the peacocks and the browns. And if we see a fritillary, we'll argue about who does that. So you could split it up so that you're only recording some of the species each. But it's not a good idea for both people to be recording because you tend to get more stuff recorded. I mean, that's one of the reasons why people like to go out when they go on a walk organised by Butterfly Conservation with other people, because you see more if there's more pairs of eyes.
Yeah, thank you. And we've got a third question, which is how do we sign up for this?
Right, well, I'm coming to that at the end, so I'll get there for that one.
Yeah,
If you bear with me, as the expression goes. So here I've got a list, look, of all these different places. And if, oh, I was told before I put this up, oh dear, I just remembered now, a bit late, that I shouldn't put these people's names up because I might not want everyone to see them, but I don't really think it's going to make a big difference. Anyway, so where there is no name, these are wider countryside butterfly survey squares, which are not currently adopted. And if you're reading this and thinking, hang on a minute, I live there, well, you're just the person we're looking for. Now, there are other types of surveys as well that we run. For instance, the reduced effort surveys, where you only look at a single species during the time that it's flying. So it's effectively the same as doing a transect, but instead of doing it all year, you just do it during the flight period of the species. So if you were really interested in, let's say, silver spotted skipper, you might go out and look for silver spotted skippers and record them assiduously several times a week, but for just a month. And then you get a lot of data about how the population changed over the month that it was flying. You might even get data if you went to 2 sites in that time about whether they both had their peak emergence at the same period, which would be quite useful to know. If one site was slightly warmer, you might expect the peak to be earlier, for instance, and then you could check whether it was. Single species surveys are conducted on butterflies and moths. And here's one moth that we looked for as a single species. The last UK record of this species, the pale shining brown, was in West Oxfordshire. I think it was 2014. I might be wrong about that, but it is no longer seen. So we're really keen to rediscover it. The last one ever in the UK was seen in Oxfordshire. It may still be there because, as I showed you on that map of Brimstone, we get fewer recorders for some reason over there. Silver-studded blue is another butterfly that we go out and look for as a single species because its numbers are so very low and it's recorded on so few sites that we're very keen to monitor both the sites where it still exists and other areas nearby that look likely to host it as they come back into better condition. And we don't only go out doing single species surveys looking for the adults. So for some species, we go out looking for the eggs. And this one, as it tells you, is the brown hair streak. The eggs are actually quite easy to find in the middle of winter when all the leaves have fallen off the bushes. I say quite easy, it's all relative. If you've tried looking for black hair streak eggs, you will agree looking for brown hair streak eggs is quite easy. We also look for caterpillars of some species, and here you've got some people looking for the striped lichnus, which is a moth which is very rare in the UK, but actually has its headquarters in this area. Unlike the pale shining brown, which had its headquarters in this area but now seems to be extinct, the striped lichnus is doing extremely well. And as you can see here, we didn't look at every single plant, obviously, but we still found over 1,000 larvae of a moth which is blacklisted, very rare in most of the UK, not found in very many counties, but we've got it. We also send teams out to go to private sites where, generally speaking, the public aren't allowed in. So quite a few MOD sites locally have teams surveying them. quite a few private estates where they don't normally like people wandering in, have got people out surveying them. And all these different survey teams, they tend to meet on a particular day of the week or perhaps a particular day of the month. And they go around and record what they see, and then they feed that information back to help with the management of the site. So if you wanted to join one of these teams, that would be entirely possible. I'll be putting some details about that on the website. Here you can see we have something called a 10K Square Champions survey, which means that an individual person looks after all the records. They don't actually have to look after them in the sense of collecting them all, but they take on responsibility for one of these little squares. And what it means is that at the end of the year, we send them every single record collected within their square, which will be hundreds or perhaps thousands of records, and they look through them to see if anything has turned up that they didn't expect, anything which looks as if it might be wrong, and if things which used to be common seem to be becoming scarce. So they just keep a check on the health of things, and of course they can help people who want, perhaps they've just moved to the area, they want to know what lives there and what they could expect to see. You can see that one or two of the squares have got a little question mark, which means the person who looks after that particular square is struggling to get right round and look at all the area, so they'd like some help. And the blue squares, unfortunately, don't have anyone at all who's interested in collecting data. Some of these make sense. I mean, look at this one, SP54. There's a tiny bit of Oxfordshire in it. So it's not much of a challenge, but equally it's not very rewarding, is it? But some of these squares, and again, look, it's this bit of Oxfordshire which tends to suffer, and bits here along the border of Bucks and Oxfordshire, down here on the border where it's half a square. One or two of these really do need someone to come up and say, yep, I don't mind looking after that bit. This can all be explained if people are interested by direct contact, I think would be the easiest way. And the sort of thing that the 10K species champions get is maps like this, which also go to the species. I think I made a mess of saying that. So the 10K square champions, the people that look after these grids, they get data very similar to the data we send out to the species champions who are looking after records of the rarest species. So this is records for white letter hair streak, and you'll see the way that they're scattered. And the person in charge of each key species can look at the way the scatter is changing, because these are showing the numbers of sightings that are made, but they can be compared with grids, similar graphs, similar maps from previous years to show how things are changing. So that's really helpful. So the 10K square champions get this sort of information, and the species champions looking after the key species get them as well. And it allows them to make a really good judgment about whether things where they live are changing, whether the species in which they're interested are doing better or worse. So if you're interested in any of this, really, probably the best way to find out a bit more about it is to go into the website. That's what it looks like when you get there. And that's the address. This will all be recorded, so if you can't find time to copy all that down, then don't worry, it's going to go up on the website and you'll be able to pause the replay at this point and somehow copy it across. But it should be fairly easy to find it by just putting Butterfly Conservation Upper Thames branch into any search engine, and it will take you straight there, I'm sure. And there'll be a lot of information about all these surveys and everything else there. And there will soon, next week, be a dedicated area under the conservation banner. I would imagine it's going to go into this drop down called surveys, because I'm going to set up a new series of pages explaining what we've been going through tonight in more detail. It is there, but it's all sort of spread about at the minute, so I'm going to bring it together into one place.
And Nick, we have a question. It says,
yep.
I work in a garden centre where we can get mullein moth caterpillars eating verbascum. If this occurs, should they be recorded, given that it's not a natural environment?
The answer is yes, please, because they must be coming in from somewhere. And the mullein moth feeding on the verbascums are really interesting, especially if some of them might turn out to be striped lichness, because the white mullein, the plant white mullein, is a food plant to striped lichness. And we believe that at the garden centre at Wendover had some striped lichness caterpillars eating their white mullein there. And we know that gardens in High Wycombe, where white mullein grows, have striped lichness feeding on it. A caterpillar that looks very much like the mullein moth. So yes, we are very interested, please, especially caterpillar photographs in this case, so that we can be sure which species we're talking about. I'm just going to move on, Ellen. We're getting towards the end, and then I'll take a whole load of questions, I hope.
Yeah.
Hope I haven't scared everybody away. So this was supposed to be slightly amusing, but it is a serious point. By the time you've collected all the bits and pieces that I said you might like to take out when you go surveying, you could have quite a bag full. And try and carry as little as possible, because the whole point is it's supposed to be fun. I love surveying. You're supposed to get a kick out of it. I do, and you should. So if at any point you think to yourself, I've been out too long and I'm fed up and tired, I want to sit down and have a rest, well, do so. You're a volunteer, you're doing it for fun. Please keep that in mind. It is an absolutely wonderful thing to do, in my opinion. At times when we're troubled, like at the moment with various nasty things hanging over us and frightening us, it's lovely to get completely out of any sort of concern and into just going out and looking at lovely things. So I'll just finish with this picture and say, we've got lots of different ways that you can be helped to make your recordings. We've got lots of different surveys that people can join in with. I would imagine we can find something for everyone, even a person who, during COVID times perhaps, has been just sitting in their own garden. We've got specialized garden recording forms. And if you're running a moth trap in your garden, we've got ways of recording the moths. If you're going out for just general walks, we can help you with forms. And the iRecord Butterfly app will have all the pictures of the butterflies that you might see in a predicted order in terms of the one you're most likely to see first. So it helps you to identify what you're looking at. And there's a sort of satisfaction, isn't there, in knowing what you're looking at, rather than saying, that's a pretty butterfly. To be able to say, that's a pretty butterfly, and I think it's a small heath. So I'm very, very grateful to the people who've come along this evening and they've been listening. Thank you very much. I'm really grateful to anyone who's going out there and making sightings and recording them for us. It's so helpful. We couldn't do the conservation work we do with the same assurance if we didn't have all these records telling us what was rare and whether what we're doing is making a difference, because obviously if we do conservation work, we want to know that the numbers are going up afterwards. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that as soon as the weather gets a little bit better, you'll be able to go out there seeing things and recording them, and that in due course, when you see that your records are being used in various publications, you can feel a certain amount of pride in knowing that you helped, that it wasn't just down to everybody else, but some of that is down to you. Thanks very much. Ellen, if we have any questions, I'll try and answer them now.
No, we haven't had any new questions coming yet. So if anyone has any other questions.
Or observations, like, could you talk more slowly?
Well, I wanted to say thank you very much, Nick. That was very useful for me anyway. And I'm already looking at the 10 square champions around Milton Keynes and thinking of all my volunteers that who I can recruit for you.
Yeah, I think you got a new recruit recently, didn't you? Was it a Danny somebody?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yes, who seems very switched on with his butterflies. I think he's recording birds on the floodplain, isn't he?
That's right. Yes, and he's done lots of butterfly transects with his grandfather, I think, in a different country.
Right.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Sorry.
No, it's great. I mean, it's really good to get some young people involved, because as people will probably tell by looking at me, I'm not a young person. And rather a lot of butterfly conservation members tend to be a bit older, but luckily quite a lot of those who go out doing surveys are younger, which is great. So they've got time to develop lots of expertise. Well, I certainly don't want to keep people sitting there with nothing happening.
Everyone's just saying thank you. So well, I'll stop recording now if there's no other questions. Yeah,
Yep. Thank you very much, Carla.
thank you.